What if the version of Mark Grayson, who stood at the very end of the Invincible comics, the emperor of the Viltrumite Empire, the man who had already lived through war, loss, rebuilding, and absolute power, was dropped right back into the heart of the Viltrumite War and forced to face Thragg at his peak? Not as a desperate young fighter, but as the finished product. The final evolution of everything Invincible was meant to become, because that changes everything from the first second of the encounter. The tone shifts, the balance of power tilts, and the entire war starts to feel less like a struggle for survival and more like a countdown to an inevitable collapse. Because this version of Mark is not learning anymore. He is not reacting, he is not holding back out of uncertainty or fear. He is decisive, experienced, and brutally efficient. And when you place that kind of mindset into a battlefield like the Viltrumite War, where every hesitation used to cost lives, the ripple effect becomes massive. Because the Mark that originally fought in that war was still figuring himself out, still struggling with morality versus necessity, still trying to find a way to win without losing himself. But Emperor Mark has already crossed that line and come back from it. He understands what it means to carry the weight of billions of lives on his shoulders. He understands sacrifice in a way that early Mark never could. And more importantly, he understands Viltrumite strategy, psychology, and pride at a level that even Thragg would not expect. So when these two finally meet on the battlefield, this is not just a clash of strength. This is a clash of eras. Old Viltrum versus new Viltrum. Raw dominance versus refined power. And the first thing that stands out is how different Mark fights. Because Thragg is used to overwhelming his opponents. He dominates through sheer force, relentless pressure, and absolute confidence. But Emperor Mark does not give him that opening. He does not rush in blindly. He studies, he adapts in real time. And when the first punches are thrown, the shock hits instantly. Because Thragg realizes that this is not the same Mark he once dismissed as a weak hybrid. This Mark hits harder, moves smarter, and takes damage without breaking focus. And that alone shifts the momentum. Because Thragg thrives on intimidation. He breaks his enemies mentally before finishing them physically. But that tactic fails here completely, because Emperor Mark has already faced worse. He has already lost people, rebuilt worlds, and led an empire. So Thragg's presence does not shake him, and that lack of fear is dangerous. Because it forces Thragg into unfamiliar territory. A fight where intimidation does not work, and brute force alone is not enough to secure victory quickly. And as the battle escalates, you start to see the real difference in endurance and efficiency. Because Emperor Mark does not waste movement. Every strike has purpose. Every dodge creates an opening. Every counter builds towards something bigger. And Thragg, for the first time, starts taking real damage early in the fight. Not superficial hits, but calculated blows aimed at weakening him over time, targeting pressure points, disrupting his rhythm, forcing him to adjust instead of dominate. And that is where things begin to spiral, because Thragg is not used to adapting mid-fight. He is used to being the constant, the unstoppable force. But here, he is being forced into a reactive position, and that frustrates him. It pushes him to fight more aggressively, more recklessly, and that plays directly into Mark's hands. Because Emperor Mark understands Viltrumite aggression better than anyone. He knows how to bait it, how to turn it against his opponent. And as the fight drags on, the gap in experience starts to show more and more. Because while Thragg has centuries of combat experience, Emperor Mark has something different. He has perspective. He has fought not just for conquest, but for survival, for peace, for rebuilding. And that gives him a strategic edge that pure warriors lack. And the battlefield itself becomes a weapon, because Mark uses his surroundings, he controls positioning, he forces Thragg into situations where his raw strength becomes less effective, whether it is dragging the fight into space where movement changes, or slamming him through structures to break momentum. Every decision is intentional. And over time, you start to see something that almost never happens. Thragg begins to slow down, not because he is weak, but because he is being outplayed. And that realization hits him hard. Because for the first time, he is facing someone who not only matches him physically, but surpasses him mentally in combat. And that is where the psychological shift becomes critical, because Thragg's identity is built on superiority, on the belief that he is the pinnacle of Viltrumite power, and Emperor Mark challenges that belief directly. Not with words, but with action. With every successful counter, every calculated strike, every moment where Thragg fails to dominate. And as that pressure builds, Thragg becomes more desperate. His attacks become heavier, more destructive, but also less precise. And that is exactly what Mark needs. Because Emperor Mark thrives in chaos. He knows how to navigate it, how to stay focused while everything around him collapses. And as the fight reaches its peak, you start to see the final difference, the killer instinct. Because early Mark hesitated, he held back, he searched for another way. But Emperor Mark knows when a fight has to end. He knows when mercy becomes a liability. And that clarity gives him the edge in the final moments. Because while Thragg is still fighting to prove his dominance, Mark is fighting to end the war, to secure the future. And that difference in objective changes everything. Because it means Mark is willing to do whatever it takes to win. And as the final exchange begins, the speed, the power, the intensity all spike to their absolute limit. Both fighters pushing beyond their usual thresholds, but only one of them is adapting in real time. Only one of them is thinking 3 steps ahead. And in that final clash, it is not just strength that decides the outcome. It is experience, control, and the ability to remain focused under pressure. And Emperor Mark capitalizes on that, finding the opening, exploiting it without hesitation, and delivering the Neron moment that shifts the entire war. Because once Thragg falls, everything changes. The Viltrumite hierarchy collapses, the fear that held entire civilizations in check disappears, and the war that once seemed endless suddenly has a clear turning point. And that is the true impact of placing Emperor Mark in this scenario. It is not just about winning a fight. It is about accelerating the end of a war, reducing the cost, saving lives that would have been lost in prolonged conflict, and reshaping the future of the Viltrumite Empire before it even has the chance to fully descend into chaos. Because Emperor Mark does not just fight to survive. He fights to rebuild, to lead, to create something better from the ashes of what came before. And in doing so, he proves that the strongest version of Invincible is not just the one who can throw the hardest punch, but the one who knows exactly when and where to throw it, and why it matters. And once Thragg drops, the war does not end in silence. It erupts into confusion. Because Viltrumites do not simply accept defeat, they are conditioned to follow strength. And for the first time in their history, that strength no longer points to Thragg, it points to Mark. And this is where Emperor Mark's presence changes the story even more than the fight itself. Because early Mark would have struggled here. He would have hesitated, questioned himself, tried to appeal to their humanity in the middle of chaos. But Emperor Mark understands timing. He understands perception. And he knows that right after a decisive victory is when leadership must be seized, not offered. So instead of stepping back, he steps forward. Blood still on him, aura still overwhelming. And he makes it clear without long speeches, without hesitation, that the war is over, because he says it is. And that shift hits the remaining Viltrumites harder than any punch ever could, because their entire culture revolves around dominance. And what they just witnessed was not a narrow victory, it was control, precision, and inevitability. And that forces them into a corner mentally. Because if Thragg, the symbol of their supremacy, can fall like that, then resisting Mark becomes less about honor and more about suicide. And that realization spreads fast, faster than any communication line. Because Viltrumites read strength instantly, and Mark's presence right now is louder than any command. And this is where the restructuring begins much earlier than it ever did in the original timeline. Because instead of a prolonged aftermath filled with scattered resistance and lingering threats, Emperor Mark compresses all of that into a single decisive moment. He establishes order immediately. And more importantly, he sets new rules just as fast, because he has already lived through what happens when Viltrumite ideology runs unchecked. He has seen the destruction, the loss, the endless cycle of conquest, and he knows that if he does not redefine their purpose right now, the same patterns will repeat. So instead of allowing them to regroup under old beliefs, he forces a new direction. Integration instead of domination, rebuilding instead of conquering. And while that idea would have sounded impossible coming from anyone else, coming from the man who just defeated Thragg, it becomes law, not because they agree, but because they have no stronger alternative. And that is the key difference. Emperor Mark does not need their approval. He needs their compliance first. And over time, that compliance becomes acceptance, because he leads by example. And that leadership starts immediately, because the battlefield is still active. There are still threats, still allies fighting, still chaos unfolding across multiple fronts. And Mark does not pause. He moves from victory into coordination. He redirects forces. He stabilizes collapsing fronts. And this is where his experience as a leader shines even more than his strength. Because he is not just a fighter anymore. He is a strategist who understands scale. He knows how to manage conflict across entire systems, not just single battles. And that allows him to end fights faster, prevent unnecessary losses, and secure key positions before enemies even realize the shift has happened. And as this unfolds, you start to see something that never existed during the original war. Unity, not perfect, not immediate, but real. Because for the first time, Viltrumites are not acting as scattered enforcers of conquest. They are acting under a single controlled vision, and that drastically reduces the overall damage. Because instead of dragging the war out through pride and resistance, Mark cuts through it with efficiency, and this has a direct impact on everyone involved, from the coalition of planets to Earth itself. Because the war that once threatened to spiral into total annihilation now starts to close much earlier. And that means fewer destroyed worlds, fewer casualties, fewer irreversible losses, and that alone reshapes the future in a massive way. Because every life saved in this moment becomes part of the rebuilding process later. And Emperor Mark understands that better than anyone, because he has already lived in that future. He knows what it takes to rebuild after devastation, and he knows how much harder it becomes when too much is lost. So every decision he makes here is not just about ending the war. It is about protecting what comes after. And that long-term vision is something Thragg never had. Because Thragg's goal was dominance, control, and expansion, but Mark's goal is stability, survival, and growth. And that difference creates a completely different outcome for the Viltrumite Empire as a whole. Because instead of being rebuilt from near extinction, it transitions earlier into something new, something less destructive, something that still carries strength but uses it differently. And that change starts influencing even the most stubborn Viltrumites. Because over time they begin to see results. They see worlds recovering instead of burning. They see alliances forming instead of collapsing, and that slowly rewires their perspective. Not out of morality, but out of effectiveness. Because at the end of the day, Viltrumites respect results, and Mark delivers them consistently. And as the dust settles, the legend of this version of Mark spreads quickly. Not just as the one who defeated Thragg, but as the one who ended the war decisively and reshaped their entire future in a fraction of the time. And that reputation matters, because it cements his authority in a way that no title ever could. And it also sends a message across the universe that the Viltrumite Empire is no longer what it used to be. And that creates a ripple effect in diplomacy and alliances, in how other civilizations respond. Because instead of preparing for inevitable conflict, they now have to adjust to a new reality where the strongest force in the galaxy is no longer driven purely by conquest. And that opens doors that were previously impossible. And at the center of all of this is Mark, not as a symbol of destruction, but as a controlled force of change. And that is where the final layer of this scenario becomes clear. Because placing Emperor Mark in the Viltrumite War does not just make him win faster, it transforms the entire outcome of the story, from the scale of the battles to the structure of the Empire to the future of every species involved. And it does so because of one key factor: experience. Not just in fighting, but in living with the consequences of those fights. In understanding what comes after victory. In knowing that ending a war is only the first step, and building something better is the real challenge. And Emperor Mark steps into that role immediately, without hesitation, because he has already walked that path once, and this time he does it earlier, faster, and with far less loss. And that is what makes this version of Mark so dangerous, not just to his enemies, but to the entire concept of how the Viltrumite Empire used to function. Because he does not just defeat the old system, he replaces it before it has the chance to recover. And in doing so, he creates a future that looks completely different from the one we originally saw. A future where the war ends sooner, the rebuilding starts earlier, and the legacy of the Viltrumites shifts from feared conquerors to controlled protectors, all because one man entered the battlefield already knowing how the story was supposed to end, and decided to rewrite it in real time.